Hi, this is Richard Azerga from Microsoft, and this is part 3 of 5 different patterns for connecting to SharePoint from an app for Office. So in some of the previous scenarios, we looked at things like an explicit login. We even looked at embedding an Office app inside a SharePoint app so that we can easily connect into SharePoint. In this scenario, we're going to look at what I call the app-only permission approach for connecting to SharePoint. So in this scenario, we've actually gone through and we've registered an app for SharePoint that has app-only permissions, and we're going to use the details of that app to connect into SharePoint. Now, in this case, because we're connecting as an app, it's going to totally ignore what a user's permissions are. It actually doesn't even care if I have a user identity. We're really going to do all our connections as an app. And that's something you need to be really careful about because we could expose information that a user normally wouldn't have access to. And so for that reason, this really isn't a great pattern for a multi-tenant app, but it might be something that's appropriate for a private app inside your organization. So really the magic that makes this happen is that we first need to register an app inside of SharePoint with app-only permissions. There's no SharePoint app user interface in this case. We've really just come out to SharePoint and used what we call the app reg new page of SharePoint. So we can simply come out to one of our site collections and go to appreg.new.aspx, and we can register an app inside of here. And that's step 1, is we need to register the app so SharePoint knows about it. Step 2 is we need to go to another page called appinv.aspx. And here we can look up our app ID. So we can simply perform a lookup using the app ID's GUID. And then we can paste in a permission level that specifies the permissions we want this app to have. Maybe it needs to be able to read all site collections in the tenant. And that we want to specify that it can do that using app-only permissions. This is kind of like running with elevated permissions. Everything's going to run with basically what the app's permissions are, regardless of what the user's permissions are. Once I have that, inside of our app for Office, we can simply use the token helper to get an app-only access token. So here we'll pass in things like the client ID, the realm of the site, and ultimately we'll be able to get an access token for connecting into this site. And all of our connections are going to be as the actual app and not the user. It really doesn't care who the user is in this scenario. So let's take a look at what this looks like running inside of our app for Office. So I'll go ahead and press play. In this case, our little MVC app is going to launch, and it's going to ask the user to specify a site that we want to connect to. It really doesn't care other than the fact that one thing we've done here is we've hard-coded what the tenant is. And again, this is a good pattern probably because I probably would never use this type of app in multi-tenant. So I think it's totally appropriate to hard-code this tenant. So you can see I have this tenant hard-coded, and I can simply specify the relative path to the site that I want. So I'll go out to site/dev, and from there, what I can do is I can go get an app-only access token. And so it'll go now and look at all the different lists that I have within that site. So I can go through and look at all of these lists and ultimately select one that I want to go get data for. So in this case, I'll select maybe the music list, and using those app-only permissions, even if I didn't have access to that music list, it'll go through and pull all the data and pull that into our workbook. In this case, we provide a little bit of an ability to go and maybe connect to a different list or a completely different site. But again, that tenant ID is hard-coded, which is, if you're going to use this app-only approach, which is really our third scenario of 5, it's really the sweet spot is an internal app and not one that would target multiple types of tenants. So again, this is option number 3 of 5, and we'll look at some of the more advanced scenarios that are really good for multi-tenancy next.